Ex nihilo nihil fit, argued for the first time in the West, according to what records we have, by Parmenides. The phrase stands at the cornerstone of several schools of Western and Eastern philosophy. Just as this phrase suggests, quantum mechanics also did not spring out of nothing in 20th century, but had a philosophical tradition, albeit not in scientific terms, going back to the early Greece, at least in the West. In this series, we will look at the roots and the stems of this tradition, its leaves, and finally its flowering into quantum mechanics. This video, while relying on a lot of history, is not about history of the schools of philosophy in ancient Greece. Only few texts of the early Greek philosophers survive, and it is hard thus to know what the actual position of these philosophers were and how they influenced each other. Thus, our focus would be on analyzing the schools of philosophy as a whole and not based on what just individual philosophers of that school thought. For in absence of their complete works, in many cases, a lot of interpretive work has to be done to understand meaning of the statements. Our story begins with Parmenides, who is called the grandfather of Western philosophy. Before Parmenides, little exists which shows Greek philosophy to be very significant and interesting, until the philosopher Parmenides put forward a question to his fellow men that would change its course. Plato writes how Parmenides debated a young Socrates in the dialogue of the same name, which is perhaps the most important of dialogues of Socrates that analyzes the question of what is truth. Parmenides discusses what he calls the way of truth in a poem which he contrasts with the way of opinion. Here, Parmenides takes a similar approach to Hindu philosophy and argues that under the way of truth, no other questions are important except of two: what is and what is not. He then argues that it is impossible for a thing to not be, because nothing that is not can come into existence. Parmenides subsequently attacks three types of metaphysical changes: coming into existence, going out of existence, and transforming from one to another. Parmenides argues that at a metaphysical level, none of the three is possible. To understand Parmenides' argument, try to imagine you being in ancient Greece and seeing a stalk of logs of wood lying at a place. The stalk of logs then burns and converts into fire and ash. Now try to analyze what happened. The wood, it appears, ceased to exist, and the ash and fire came into being from apparently nowhere or inside the wood. Either the wood transformed into fire and ash, or the fire and ash appeared from nothingness, and wood disappeared into nothingness. Parmenides then asks you to defend any of the three ideas. If the wood transformed into fire and ash, why did not do so before? What compelled wood to convert into fire and ash? You might here reply that wood's association with something like heat converted it into fire and ash. Yet, if indeed that was the case, then would it not be true that whatever was before did not cease to exist but was just transformed? And nothing was created, but just the appearance of what was before changed. This view is precursor to what is known as meteorological nihilism, which is the view that composite objects do not exist, but only things that compose them. However, when one believes such a view, the question becomes, what are the things that create all other things? Parmenides believed that what is the ground of all is a non divisible, continuous, eternal thing, which is full of itself. Parmenides also argued that to be aware is to be, a view which in parts would be invoked by both Rene Descartes and Bishop Berkeley in 17th and 18th centuries, respectively. Parmenides' philosophy was so significant to Greek philosophy that philosophers subsequent to Parmenides began searching for the answers to the questions which Parmenides raised. Two philosophers tried to answer Parmenides: Democritus and Anaxagoras. Lysippus and his pupil Democritus have been credited to be the first known propounders of theory of atomism in the West. Of them, Democritus is more important, for he is more well known. Democritus, our laughing philosopher, was a materialist. His philosophy can be understood in very simple terms. A piece of wood gradually decays, so do rocks. In fact, by mere observation, one can conclude that most things decay, even if the decay is so small to be seen with the naked eye. What is also observable is how a similar wood is created again and again when the seed of the fruit of a tree is planted into the ground. Also, there must be an internal movement in the objects we see, like, for example, water which flows. When the water flows, it must flow in parts, and hence parts of water must exist that have their own movement. Not only that, matter must be able to lose or gain properties over time, just in a way as water becomes frozen and then converts back into the liquid form. These two properties of matter are largely observable to naked eye and do not require any metaphysical pondering without an empirical support. Thus, Democritus's view formed a precursor to modern materialism. The two properties of the matter point to two inferences about nature of things. As matter can decay and mix with other matter, it must be composed of small parts. Because the matter loses and regains its properties, the properties of matter must come from these small parts. It is important to note here as how this view basically adopts an early meteorological nihilism to solve the challenge of Parmenides. Because things are not continuous, they can transform. Yet the constancy that remains, which Parmenides argued for, is saved by the presence of smaller indivisible parts that are responsible for change in the form of matter. The best example of it is perhaps a pot made of clay, wherein the flexible clay can be used to craft firm pots of varying sizes and shapes. The pot can be shaped because the atoms are so small that it appears that they have been molded into a new form, yet they remain intact. These indivisible parts, in Democritus's view, would have been eternal and indivisible, and thus the material reality was discrete and eternal. This is the early materialism. This materialism of Democritus, however, unlike materialism of today, was more philosophical in nature than scientific, and thus the ethics derived of it were also more philosophical in nature. Democritus's metaphysical view led to the morality of Stoicism in an interesting way. The world was full of change due to constant interaction between the atoms, and nothing composite was expected to remain constant, for there was nothing else that would grant composite objects a life of eternity. Because of changing nature of reality, real happiness was impossible to be found in external objects, for they all were susceptible to decay and transformation. A steady state of mind that was not obsessed to what is changing created real happiness and was the goal of a moral person. Thus, the philosophy was a form of enlightened hedonism. What Democritus's view lacked was an intelligent force that could shape the world. If the world was just pure matter, what accounted for rationality? Anaxagoras, who was older than Democritus, answered Parmenides' problem in a different way. He argued for the presence of mind. The world consisted of two things: chaotic matter, which was made of infinitesimal eternal objects, and a nous. The chaotic matter interacted and was sometimes given direction by the mind. The composite objects acquired or lost properties as the relative proportion of the eternal parts that made up them changed. Thus, Anaxagoras attempted to answer four important metaphysical questions: what makes up things in universe? What gives the things direction and makes knowledge possible? What compels change in things? And how objects gained or lost properties are transformed into one another? Like Democritus, Anaxagoras also believed in constancy, but it was reduced to the constancy exhibited by the eternal, infinitely small ingredients that made up composite objects. This could be said to be the origination of three separate but closely related streams of ontology. Like Parmenides, Democritus believed that the reality was composed of one type of substance, but unlike Parmenides, he believed that the substance was not one but many. Anaxagoras, however, believed that the reality was composed of two types of substances, for he believed in strict separation of rationality from what is not rational. Yet he agreed with Parmenides that the substance that made up things was for all practical purposes continuous, and actual void did not exist, unlike Democritus. While Parmenides questioned the metaphysical reality of change, Democritus argued that change in composite objects was possible because they were made up of smaller eternal parts called atoms. Anaxagoras defended the reality of change, but he argued that instead of presence of few different types of the eternal parts in an object, it is the proportion of various parts in the chaotic mix which dictates properties of a particular object, and the change in proportion was responsible for change in the object. The distinction between Anaxagoras' and Democritus' view is important as it has implications for modern scientific theories of matter, because Anaxagoras is arguing for a continuous form of matter. His view is a precursor to wave theories of matter, unlike Democritus, whose view resembles particle theories of matter. The interesting part is that on wave theory of matter, the interaction between mind and matter is also possible far more easily, and thus the mind acquiring central place in Anaxagoras' view reinforces its link to modern philosophical interpretations of dualism. While both Parmenides and Democritus disagree with substance dualism, with Parmenides believing reality we see as illusion created by faulty epistemology, and Democritus believing the reality we see as just complex manifestation of interaction between the subparts, Anaxagoras believes duality to be the fundamental part of the universe. When the views of these pre Socratic philosophers reached Plato and then Aristotle, they created philosophies which can be seen as a mixture of the philosophies of these early philosophers. Here it would be worthwhile to keep Socrates in the camp of Plato, because from him we know about Socrates in most significant way. Plato agreed with Parmenides about the necessity of constancy of nature of things. Yet, like Democritus, he ascribes it not to a single entity, but a large number of entities. Thus, the primal reality, that is the realm of ideas, contained true depictions of objects that we observe and qualities we encounter, and while existing in a metaphysical unchanging state, consists of many forms and not just one unchanging reality. While change in the form is not possible, change in our perception of the imperfect instantiations is possible. People's opinion does distort reality, but so does the phenomena arising out of complex interaction between instantiations of multiple forms. Plato's student Aristotle, however, in his view seemed to harmonize the philosophy of Democritus and Anaxagoras. Unlike Plato's realm of ideas, the forms are instantiated into objects only and are not found separately. Mind and matter both exist, and forms could be potentially infinite in number, for objects could be potentially infinite in number. Change is possible because of the change in underlying matter or the underlying form, which together form an object, a view scholarly known as hylomorphic dualism. Thus, a brass ring can be converted into a gold ring, or a bronze ring, or an iron ring, or a silver ring. In each of these cases, the changes are discrete and not continuous, for there is a strict differentiation between a brass ring and other types of rings. However, a brass ring can also be changed by change in its form. For example, shape. The ring can approximate shape of a circle to various degrees which are relatively more continuous, at least in abstraction. In Aristotle's view, duality of the hylomorphic view is both an appearance and a fact of the world. It is a fact of the world according to Aristotle because Aristotle derives his form of dualism from philosophical inquiry. It is an appearance too because a form cannot separate from the underlying matter to exist in a realm of ideas. The views of Plato and Aristotle both form the cornerstone of ancient Western philosophy. Interestingly, while none of the philosophers discussed here possibly knew about the future modern scientific developments at that time, their discussions do fit in with one or the other theories of science, though with changes appropriate for modern context. In any case, these views form the foundation of philosophy of quantum mechanics in the West. In the next episode, we will look at the science behind quantum mechanics and its development through ages.